I have asked this question before. What do you really know about Alexander Hamilton's life accomplishments? Like, what do you remember about him? Well, sadly, if there's one thing, it's probably the duel, but I guess when the former Secretary of the Treasury and the current Vice President shoot at each other, that's going to grab attention. That's certainly what history remembers. And you probably also know that he was the Secretary of the Treasury. That's really the most important thing that he did. It's not really something you're going to get from the show necessarily. Like, he was the Secretary of the Treasury, but how important his accomplishments there were, that's not quite there. Well, that's cool. The show is mostly about the guy and it's more personal than just the listing of political accomplishments. But he did that. You probably know it. You probably know he wrote the Federalist Papers. It might sound familiar, but the show once again kind of focuses on the cabinet fights, which happened after we already had a constitution and a president, and the Federalist Papers were before that and were necessary to get the president in the first place. You know that he fought in the war. You might not know exactly how crucial he was. We'll talk about that in a second. And you know that he was an aide to Washington, but there's something that is not in the show that Lin-Manuel Miranda and Ron Chernow could not possibly have known. It's based on new documents that were uncovered in 2023, and it shows that Alexander Hamilton was even more central to the creation of the Constitution than anyone thought before. What did those documents tell us? What did Alexander Hamilton do that led so directly to the U.S. Constitution? So much so that we can fairly say that without Hamilton, there would be no U.S. Constitution. Well, grab your quill pen in case you need to take notes. We're going to find out on this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. First of all, before I say anything else, let me just say thank you. I appreciate you listening to the show. This is really for people who love musical theater, who have a deep interest in history, want to see the two connected, and like a good ghost story whenever we can find one. That's you, and you're listening to this, and I appreciate that you're doing it. If you get a chance, do please share it and drop me an email just to let me know what you think. And I appreciate all the contact that I get, and you are the most important thing driving the show and keeping it out there. So thanks again, and anything you can do to give it a boost, I appreciate. We have some quizzes, some trivia shows coming up. I'm going to embed that in the Buzzsprout site. So if that's where you get this podcast, you'll find it there. But anyway, I'll try to put it in the descriptions wherever those come out. But if you like trivia and you want to kill some time while you're sitting on a train or a bus or just on your couch, this is going to be a lot of fun, I hope. It's going to be something that adds to the show and to the content. If you've listened to all these episodes, I think you're going to do really well. If not, it'll be a fun little teaser to hopefully, let you figure out what it is you want to know more about and direct you to the episodes that you can see. Keep an eye out for that. This is our 12th out of 12 episodes that we've done on Hamilton. Our next series is going to start up next. It's going to be Chicago for the next one, but I would like your input. So far, we've done The Man of La Mancha, Les Mis, Cats, The Phantom, Jesus Christ Superstar, Hamilton. We're going to do Chicago next. And what should I do after that? I'd love to know what you think. Grab that email off the website and shoot it to me. I will also drop it in the description in case you're interested. But if you have a show you would like to know more about and you'd like me to do the research on your behalf, I'm happy to do that. I've got some ideas bouncing around, but if there's something that you particularly want to know about, give me a shot. Okay, that's it by way of preliminaries. We're about to get into this episode, and our three main topics are just kind of the background, how Hamilton got involved in the Constitution. Then the second thing we'll talk about is all the stuff that happened in New York that led to the National Constitutional Convention. And then we will get to the convention and finally its aftermath. And I can just promise you, Alexander Hamilton is going to be in the middle of all of it. Without further ado, the background. What did Hamilton do? And what was the situation immediately after the Revolutionary War? So this is everything you need to know to understand what Hamilton did that was so central to the creation of the United States Constitution. And like I said before, it's one of the fun things about this is new stuff. This was not known in 2015 when the show came out. It was not known to Chernow when he wrote his book, but it is something that we do know now. And I think it makes an even more fascinating Alexander Hamilton story. Okay, background. Alexander Hamilton, of course, arrives in New York from the island in the Caribbean. And he almost immediately enrolls in Columbia, gets his degree at lightning fast speed. And before the war, he was an agitator. He did some writing in pamphlets. So he was in favor of the revolution, but he also saved the president of Columbia University from angry students and mobs who thought that he was too tight with the Brits. But that was sort of him leading in there. Then in 1776, famously, the Revolutionary War starts, and Hamilton is a soldier. He signs up. He wants to fight. He wants to take a gun and mix it up. One of the first actions that he takes, he's actually trapped on the island of Manhattan during what is a retreat event. The general that he's fighting under wants to hold their ground and fight to the bitter end where they will probably all die, but they are rescued when this guy rides in on a horse, comes up with an escape plan that will save the army. The general says no. The horse rider talks him into it. That horse rider who saves the army, including Alexander Hamilton, is actually Aaron Burr. And if you're interested in all of that backstory, that's one of our first episodes in the series. He fights successfully. He becomes an aide to Washington. He quits kind of in a huff that wasn't way more his fault than Washington's, but he returns to direct action. And at the Battle of Yorktown, he and Lafayette are in charge of taking what are called redoubts. Now, a redoubt is a little fort outside a fort. So imagine there's a big fort and then there's a bunch of little outposts right in front of it. Usually they're made out of dirt, but sometimes they got like logs and bricks, so they're kind of smaller. But taking these redoubts, there's two of them that are pretty important. Redoubts numbers 9 and 10. And in charge of taking those two are Lafayette and Hamilton. And in some really brave action, they both succeed. Now, it's probably an exaggeration to say that those two guys directly won the war, but both of them had a key moment in the most decisive battle. What they did is kind of like winning the charge at Gettysburg or leading the charge at D-Day or winning the Battle of Britain, right? Being the pilot who saves London during World War II. That's sort of how important their role was. And the Battle of Yorktown is then won. And that basically ends the war in October of 1781. So there's, of course, ongoing skirmishes, but Yorktown's the decisive part. When that's done, the die is cast and the Continentals are going to win. All right. That happens in October of 1781. So I'm going to say this because I have to constantly keep reminding myself. Easy to remember, the war starts in 1776, a little bit harder to remember that it ends in October of 1781. So 1781, that's the date the Revolutionary War ends. Okay, so at that whole time, the way the whole nation is being governed is, of course, the Articles of Confederation. Those are initially drafted in 1776. They're not actually ratified until later. So like half a year before the war ends is when we actually finally ratified the Articles of Confederation. There's a Continental Congress that's kind of governing things up till then. But now we got a new country and we have a set of Articles of Confederation. The year is 1781. There is no president. Congress rules the country directly. And the big debates are about how much power the central government should have, what to do about the debt that was incurred in the war, and then to a lesser extent, what's going to happen with Western expansion. That's got to be an issue, but that's not one that's going to end the country. But the central government, the debt questions, those might. So those are the big ones at the beginning. And there was huge war debt. Most of it is owned by the states, but they fought for the new federal government. So from the states' perspective, they're like, yeah, we took on a bunch of debt, but we did that to create you, federal government. We feel like this is kind of your debt to pay off. And the feds are like, yeah, okay, well, that's cool, but you actually own the debt and you have the Articles of Confederation. So you want to maintain all the power. You're not giving us the power to raise any funds. So how are we supposed to pay it? It's kind of a great big mess. And that's what's going on the debt front. On the government front, the Articles of Confederation mostly have a lot of limits on what the federal government could do. In fairness, they don't want to have another British style of government with too much central power. But on the downside, without that central government power, fights break out between the states and national security is difficult to arrange. Interstate commerce is difficult. So most of the governing is actually being done by the states, and there is still a federal Congress, a United States Congress there, but they don't have a ton of power. There's not a lot of stuff they can do. And so the states, which do have the power, are doing most of the actual governing. And it is not going well. There are mutinies afoot, that there are rebellions happening. Most notably, Shays Rebellion is going on. That is over the debt crisis. There was basically a huge debt. The government tried to create taxes, and in response, the rebels decided they were going to overthrow the government. Fun footnote, it's called Shays Rebellion, and the people who participated were called Shayites or Shayites. But there's a big historical argument that Shay actually didn't really have that much to do with the rebellion. But it is a rebellion nonetheless. And so if you were to look around and say, hey, we just won this war, but there are mutinies and rebellions going on, and things are generally worse off economically and safety-wise than they had been under Britain. So we just cast off Britain. We have all this liberty. What are we doing with it? And the answer is it looks like we're kind of messing things up. We do not have a thriving economy. It's not super safe. And that is creating a bit of a crisis. So the issue is, what are we going to do? Something has to be done. All right. And so all this is just to say we have two big problems that are forming the United States in 1781. How much power should the federal government have? And what are we going to do about the debt? Those are the two questions that we have to resolve. Okay. That's all background and context. Let's now move on to our first topic. What is going on in the state of New York? And the main source here is Aditya, Aditya Bamzai, Bamzai. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. My apologies, but that's what it looks like to me. Bamzai is a professor of law at the University of Virginia. So ironically, that's Thomas Jefferson School, and wrote an article in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy that was published in 2023. So that was just 3 years ago, way after Chernow's book, and at least 8 years after the musical opened. So these are things that we now know, that we can now focus on, that were not known at the time that the Hamilton the musical was created. So this is more stuff about the life of Alexander Hamilton, an extension of which I learned about Hamilton in the show. Okay, well, the central problem, as I had mentioned, was that the Continental Congress could not collect revenue. James Madison made a list. He said, what are the problems with the Articles of Confederation? And the first one was that we could not raise money. The federal government had no way of collecting revenue. So the Continental Congress tried to impose what was called an impost. That's a 5% tariff on imports. Geez, 5%, that seems so tame now, doesn't it? But the New York Constitution said the New York legislature had, quote, supreme legislative power, end quote. And so the general feeling in New York was that meant it could not be delegated to anyone, including the Congress. That was the states has supreme legislative power, not the national government, not any other entities. And so the feeling was, and the predominant view, and certainly the view of the governor of New York, who was Clinton, said it would violate the New York State Constitution for the state of New York to delegate to the Continental Congress the authority to impose tariffs on goods coming into New York. New York is, of course, then and now, a great big port city. Lots of stuff gets shipped in, lots of stuff gets shipped out. And for the purposes of New York, they wanted to be the ones that would charge any import duties, that impost. And they didn't want the feds to be able to come in and do that because obviously then importers would be less willing to do business in New York if they were getting double charged by both the feds and states. And because the state constitutions were stronger under the Articles of Confederation than the Articles themselves were, that pretty much sealed the deal. That if a state said, our Constitution says you can't do this, there's nothing in the Articles of Confederation that said that the feds could trump what the states wanted to do. Now, all that got called the non-delegation doctrine. So that's the phrase to remember, the non-delegation doctrine. And the debates around it had been brewing since at least 1781, right when the Americans, the rebellion was first winning the war. The question was, if the state constitution did not allow the state to delegate its authority to the federal government, then the state of New York could not, even if they wanted to, let the federal government impose tariffs. Okay, so that's 1781. And in February of 1787, Alexander Hamilton gives a speech to the New York Assembly, and he focused on this non-delegation doctrine. Basically, what he thought was the clause only applied to power struggles within the state of New York and not between New York and other entities like the Continental Congress or a federal government, whatever that would become. So he said, yeah, sure, the New York Constitution says the legislature has supreme executive power, but that's only talking about when the legislature gets into power struggles with other entities in the state, like municipal codes or I guess whatever counted as a county back then. Okay, so this is awesome. Here is what Bomzai has to say about this. Quote, in this article, I have uncovered essays and papers written about the legislative vesting provision of the New York Constitution in the critical years and months preceding the Constitution's adoption, end quote. All right, so there is a connection between this fight about non-delegation and what Bomzai calls the legislative vesting provision. It's brewing in New York, and Bomzai has uncovered articles that will connect that very directly to the U.S. Constitution. So what is it that these papers show? Quote, the impost controversy precipitated a crisis that led to the convention that wrote the Constitution of the United States. It is not much exaggeration to say that this was the legal debate that led to the creation of the United States, with the non-delegation doctrine under the New York Constitution playing a starring doctrinal role, end quote. So, wow, that's debate in the New York legislature. Bomzai has evidence that says that debate led to the crisis that led to the Constitutional Convention that led to the Constitution of the United States, and the non-delegation doctrine of the New York Constitution played the starring role. All right, so let's find out what happened in that speech. What was the speech that Hamilton gave? Okay, Hamilton at the time is 32 years old, but he is a leader of the New York faction that wants more federal authority. And part of that faction includes John Jay. The governor at the time is George Clinton, and he opposes it. He, in fairness to Clinton, he's the governor of New York. He wants the state of New York to be getting all the tax revenue that's come through the ports, and he doesn't want the feds to get it. Fair enough. That's Clinton's position. And Clinton, that Clinton name should sound familiar to you if you have been on this podcast, but if not, they're basically at the time, there are not political parties as we know them today, or even any embryonic political parties. In fact, as we've talked about in prior episodes, the very first political party was the Federalists that was created by Alexander Hamilton. So where does political power come from? Well, basically, there are three big families in New York who are defining the political affiliations, and they're the Clintons, the Livingstons, and the Schuylers. And Hamilton is, of course, on Team Schuyler. And Clinton, who's one of the other big families in New York at the time, is the governor. And what he wants, of course, is the revenue for the state. So political power in New York at the time is defined by your family affiliation more than any political party affiliation. Those are the three big families. And Clinton is on one side, Schuyler's on the other. Hamilton's there for the Schuylers, but Hamilton also mostly just wants a really strong federal government. And we'll learn how strong in a little bit. So in 1781, the Continental Congress makes its first proposal. They want to collect a tariff in the state of New York. And that started the fight. So the Continental Congress says, we, the federal government, to raise revenue to pay for the war debt, are going to put tariffs on goods coming into New York in 1781. New York rejects it. So in 1786, for 5 years now, they've been going back and forth. They passed some resolutions to force the issue again, and New York again rejected that. So the Continental Congress asked Clinton to convene a special session to reconsider it. And Clinton refused. And so there's a lot of back and forth between Clinton and the federal government. In the words of Bomzai, quote, the stage was set for the final scenes of the drama, for Alexander Hamilton's famous speech on the impost's connections to the New York Constitution, and precipitated by the chain of events for the convention that drafted the United States Constitution, end quote. All right, the stage is set because they're supposed to reconvene the New York legislature to reconsider letting the federal government impose these tariffs. And so impost means basically the same thing as the tariff in here. All right. So step one, Alexander Hamilton gives two speeches trying to get that special session convened. He wants He loses both times in the Assembly and the Senate. So Hamilton is now 0 for 2. Step 2, the Assembly gets a committee to write a bill that will grant the federal authority. So there's not a special session to reconsider it, but the Assembly on its own, which I think where Hamilton is going to write a bill that will grant the feds authority. And the chair of that committee is a guy named William Malcolm, who is an ally of Hamilton. Now, there's some technicalities and there might be some compromise positions, but essentially that bill is all about state and federal authority. And then just for fun and the way things were done in the day, like we now have internet posts, blogs, and memes and whatnot, and that increasingly creeps into politics. But this bill is getting considered, and there are a bunch of pamphlets that come out. And the style of the day is you would write the pamphlet under a pseudonym, usually some great Greek or Roman character was the name that you would pick. And they are actively lobbying for and against various positions. So going into this debate, going into this fight for this bill to be considered, there's all kinds of pamphlets being released, or the people who write the pamphlets are really ramping it up to get their point of view out there. The debate starts on February 15th, 1787. Provision number 1 lets the feds do some taxing to recover war debts. So you do get a tax, but only for the limited purpose of recovering war debts. And that passes, are you ready for this? 29 to 28. That is 1 vote. So that is how divided they are. Provision number 2, it gives the feds broader power than that the feds can do tariffs and probably just beyond war debts. And that one loses convincingly, 38 to 19. Provision number 3 lets the feds collect within New York the taxes from provision number 1. And this is when Hamilton gives his speech. All right, so I want you to take a moment right now. Imagine in your mind, make this real. Here's Lin-Manuel Miranda standing up, whatever in your head you visualize Hamilton as. And he's giving this speech. He talks for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and he is mostly not really addressing, he's talking about the provisions, but he's mostly responding to the pamphlet. And the main point that he wants to make is that the Constitution was limited within the state, not outside the state. That's what he's going to talk about. So now in your mind, you've got Hamilton standing up there and he's talking for 1 hour and 20 minutes. And he is just going to town on, yes, the New York City, the state of New York has a constitution. And yes, within the state of New York, there is supreme legislative authority in our legislature. But that doesn't mean that legislature can't enter into agreements with other entities like a federal government and let them come in and do what needs to be done in New York, even if that includes taxing. Now, I just want you to notice that's a legal argument. It's not a policy one. They're not talking about this is the right way to do it, or this is the correct balance between the federal government and the state government. He's not saying it's better to centralize federal power. He's just arguing for a narrower interpretation of the language of the New York Constitution. And that's what lawyers do all the time. Legal documents need to be interpreted. There's always broad interpretations and narrow interpretations. That's kind of what this debate is going to come down to. And Hamilton is all in on the narrow interpretation. Now, he did kind of get to that question when he's talking about what other states might do. So there's a kind of a precedent argument, like if we don't do this and the other states won't, and then the federal government will collapse, that's bad for us. But that's not really the main thrust of his argument. It was a brilliant speech. In the words of Baumzai, quote, his speech before the New York Assembly responding to the criticisms of the impost has long been viewed as a landmark in American rhetoric. End quote. Hamilton is a brilliant lawyer. The idea was that, and he actually was on this, often would team up with Aaron Burr. And the rule of the day was when they were together, they were unbeatable. And when they were separate, they were the 2 best speakers in the colonies. Maybe Burr was a little better, but Hamilton was right there. And this absolutely fantastic public speaker put everything he had into this issue that he cared so passionately about. It is something they still study in American public speaking classes and rhetoric classes. If you're studying the great American speeches of all time, which actually I do, that's kind of my field, this is one of them. This brilliant speech delivered. It's a mic drop moment because nobody stands up and responds to it. And then the legislature immediately voted against him 36-21. So all he accomplished was to get 2 more votes than provision number 2 had got, and his provision lost 36-21. Okay, well, that's politics for you. We stand up and give speeches for people who have mostly already made up their minds, or at least there's nothing anyone could say it's going to get them to move. And boy, that still is happening. I just came from a meeting of the Fullerton City Council where you could still watch that happen all the time. Anyway, and not just Fullerton City Council, that's kind of the way politics goes. Sadly, you can make a better argument and a brilliant legal argument and still then look up and discover that everyone is going to vote against you anyway. That happens to Alexander Hamilton. Okay, so what do? There you are. You have just poured everything you had into it, had your mic drop speech, and you lost. You lost on 2 of the 3 provisions. The only thing that you won by 1 vote. That's not a lot. So what do? You could give up. You could get frustrated. You could get angry. But that's not really Alexander Hamilton. That's not the young, scrappy, and hungry guy that we have come to know through the musical. So let's figure out what he did do. That is the issue percolating in New York, and he's just lost his vote on February 15th. Let's remember that, February 15th, 1787. Well, the next thing that happens is there's going to be a convention. And this happens almost immediately after that vote in New York. There is sort of afoot generally a movement to hold a national delegation to revise the Articles of Confederation, that whatever else is going on with New York and the impost duties and the tariff powers, everyone can kind of see the Articles of Confederation need some fixing. John Jay is proposing and writes to Washington about an overhaul of the Articles of Confederation, and quote, 2 days after Hamilton's speech on the impost on February 17th, 1787, the New York Assembly adopted a resolution to instruct the state's delegates in Congress to recommend the holding of a convention to revise the Articles, end quote. All right. So on February 15th, the date we are remembering, Hamilton loses his vote. 2 days later, they are deciding whether or not they're going to send delegates to this convention to revise the article. Well, that passes by 1 vote. So let's just consider that. Without that 1 vote, there is no New York participation in the Constitutional Convention. And then it probably doesn't pick up New York. And then as now, you can't really have a United States if you don't have New York. That is how close. 1 vote. They're within 1 vote of New York not sending anyone to the Constitutional Convention. Alexander Hamilton then proposes a resolution in the Assembly to appoint 5 delegates to the convention. We're going to send 5 people. That gets reduced to 3. And then on March 6th, those 3 are elected. 1 is John Lansing, 1 is Robert Yates, and 1 is Alexander Hamilton. Yates is really anti-delegation. Like, he's the one who says the state of New York cannot delegate its authority. We have supreme authority, state power over federal power. He's been proposing that. He is Hamilton's arch rival on this question. Lansing is on the side of Yates, and Hamilton is, of course, in favor of delegation. He wants New York to be able to delegate its authority to the federal government. Now it passes. Okay, so they have now decided they're going to send a delegation, and they've got their 3 guys, but they also pass a proviso that basically says that that delegation can't agree to anything that would violate the New York Constitution, by which they mean we don't want anything that reduces the sovereignty of the state of New York. That is what Clinton wants. That is what Yates wants. That is what this delegation has sent out. Okay, so now you're Alexander Hamilton. You've lost your vote. You got on the committee. You're a minority on a committee because there's 3 of them and 2 of them disagree with you. And you're going there with explicit instructions that you should not do exactly what you want to do. What do you do if you're Alexander Hamilton? Let's find out. Off they go. And in the middle of the convention, Yates and Lansing leave, saying that what's going on there is way beyond revising the Articles of Confederation. Basically, the same arguments for the impost debate are kind of going on. They're flipping back and forth. The purpose of the convention was not explicitly to write a new constitution. The purpose of the convention was to fix the Articles of Confederation, and Some people wanted big changes, some people wanted small changes, but that's the only explicit mandate that convention had. That we've got to fix these Articles of Confederation. And when Yates and Lansing got there and saw it was going to be way more than that, they were like, we are out of here. We were sent by Governor Clinton and the New York legislature with the instructions that we should not agree to anything that would restrict the power of New York. Hamilton stays. The convention writes a whole new constitution, and then they send it to the states for ratification. Now, here I'm going to turn away from Bomzai. Bomzai is mostly just concerned with the doctrine, so doesn't really need to address what happened at the Constitutional Convention. That's not the concern of that article. So I'm going to turn to the National Constitution Center for the rest. That's our they take their stuff, they put it on a website. Anyway, I think it's fun for us to figure out how the convention played out. So we're going to ask the National Constitutional Center of the United States, tell us. Now, before the one in Philadelphia, there had been an Annapolis Convention in 1786, and Alexander Hamilton had been there, and he called for a second convention that would, quote, replace the Articles of Confederation with an energetic national government, end quote. So everybody knew what Hamilton wanted, and it was exactly the opposite of what Clinton and those other two guys, Yates and Lansing, wanted. So he calls for a second convention. That is the convention that we all remember, the one that happened in Philadelphia in 1787. Now, mostly, Hamilton did not say anything. You are Alexander Hamilton. You have been sent with the instructions not to say what you want to say. But at one point in the debate, there are two proposals on the table. One is just to amend the articles and strengthen them a little bit. There is a second one from Virginia, which goes a little bit farther to strengthen the federal government. But I have asked you the question, you're Alexander Hamilton. What are you going to do? Well, he's been sitting there. He's been quiet the whole time. He looks at these two proposals, and then he brings the thunder. Quote, Hamilton rose to reject both options. He spoke for 6 hours, dismissing a simple revision of the articles, but also insisting that the Virginia plan did not go far enough as a blueprint for a new government. He proposed instead what he considered the essentials of a sound government, a bicameral legislature with the power to pass all laws, a House elected by the people for 3 years, a Senate elected by electors from electoral districts to serve for life, and a solitary executive to be chosen by the people voting in electoral districts who would serve for good behavior. As a fervent nationalist, he also proposed that state governments would be appointed by the federal government. End quote. Parts of that probably sound like our government today, and parts of it really do not. But Alexander Hamilton was a really smart guy, and he had his very strong opinions and had bottled them up. But, he did not seem constrained by what he had been told to do by the New York legislature. He lost 2 votes in New York. He got sent to this constitutional convention. The other 2 guys he was with stormed off. He was not supposed to say anything that would reduce the power of the New York legislature, and he just couldn't do it anymore. He stood up and he said exactly what he thought. That was really, really radical. In fact, he spoke for 6 hours and it was done. The general reaction was, that guy's kind of nuts. James Madison left some notes, tried to figure out why he went so radical. The Constitution Center website says this, quote, whatever his motivation, Hamilton had crossed a line. He would forever be tarred in some circles as a monarchist, end quote. He has come out so much in favor of his strong federal government that he's pretty much standing by himself now. He wants a stronger national government than almost anybody else. The first speech was brilliant, but nobody voted for it. The second speech was not received well. He talked for 6 hours, and when it was all done, people just sort of thought he was nuts. He then left to return to his law offices, and then Lansing and Yates left on July 10. Hey, but you know what's nice? To have Washington on your side. George Washington wrote to Hamilton and asked him to return. And I've not seen people make the claim that that directly led to him turning around and getting there. But by God, when George Washington invites you to come back, that's nice. Hamilton does reluctantly return and he does so towards the end of the convention. So New York's delegation was 3 guys, all of them left at one point. Lansing and Yates have now left for good, and only because George Washington talked Hamilton back in did he return. But when he's there, he sits on the final drafting committee. The original draft of the Constitution had 7 articles, didn't have the Bill of Rights yet, but they went from 23 down to 7, and he was part of the drafting and details committee, so they had broad strokes, and then they sent a committee away to come up with specific language, and they got that back. According to that American Constitution website, he was bummed. He was not happy about the outcome, but he signed it. He was a signator on the United States Constitution. It was signed in September of 1787. What they wanted was the unanimous support of everyone, but what they got was 11 states and, quote, the lone remaining representative from New York, end quote, who was, of course, Alexander Hamilton. The original United States Constitution got signed by 11 states before it got ratified, right? So it's still got to get ratified. But who signs it? It's 11 states and Alexander Hamilton, the guy who came from New York, ignored the rules. They lost his votes in New York, got on himself on the committee anyway, came out, said exactly what he had to say, got rejected for doing so, but still came back. And as the lone representative of New York, still at the convention, signed the original U.S. Constitution. Whew. All right. So that gets us through our first 2 topics. What happened in New York? What happened at the Constitutional Convention? And now, what happened after the Constitutional Convention? Well, it's got to get ratified. There's a ratification debate going on, and a newspaper called the New York Journal published a set of articles under a new pseudonym. So it's another pamphlet war where people are writing under fictitious names that are things like Cicero and whatnot. Publius, Cato is one. But these are probably written by Cato himself, and they were very much opposed to this new constitution, right? Clinton did not want them to be ratified, and so under a pseudonym, Clinton is publishing these attack pieces on the Constitution. But much more famously, right? Do you remember Clinton's articles written as Cato in the New York Journal? You probably don't. But much more famously, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay write the Federalist Papers, which are open advocacy for the ratification of the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton, who gave his speech at the convention and got ignored, got treated like a crazy man, but then came back, helped draft the final copy, is now the most prominent public advocate for the Constitution, or at least Madison and Jay, I think, wrote one of them, but Hamilton and Madison write the vast majority of them. And it's those Federalist Papers that take on what's going on in the New York Journal and decidedly win the day. They swing public opinion. I've mentioned this many times, but they are, they're bound up. You can still buy copies of them from conventional publishers. They are still cited by the United States Supreme Courts. If you were to say what were the things that led to the ratification of the Constitution after it was written, almost everyone universally points to those Federalist Papers, and that was Hamilton as much as it was anybody. Okay, so, that convention, that was September of 1787, it gets signed. The debates rage on until February of 1788, where the New York legislature is now going to meet to decide whether to ratify the Constitution. Okay, boy, this is a little WWF on the White House law in action that's going to happen here. So step 1. There is a resolution introduced that is condemning Alexander Hamilton for going off to write a new constitution when he was told, just go there to revise the Articles of Confederation and don't do anything to reduce the power of the New York Constitution. Now, I got to say, I'm on Hamilton's side, but that's not unreasonable, right? We are the New York legislature. We voted by one vote to send a delegation, and then we told them not to do anything like write a new constitution, and you did anyway. So the very first thing we're going to do is condemn you for directly disobeying what we told you to do, and that resolution fails. 27-25. That is, of course, 2 votes. So here's your box score. The vote for sending the delegation passed by 1 vote. The vote condemning that delegation, which was really only Hamilton, failed by 2 votes. So now we're at step 2. Step 1 is, do we condemn Alexander Hamilton? The answer is no. Step number 2 is, okay, well, fine then. Are we going to ratify this Constitution? Well, New York was a, quote, hotbed of anti-federalism. So getting this thing ratified was going to be no small feat. It needed to happen. And of course, the public opinion war was being fought between the Federalist Papers and what Clinton was writing in the New York Journal. Here is what Bomsay says, quote, against all odds, at the New York Convention in Poughkeepsie in June and July of 1788, the Federalists, led by Hamilton and Jay, prevailed in persuading their fellow New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution, end quote. That the 9th signature that was necessary to get the U.S. Constitution ratified happened at the end of June 21st, 1788. The Constitution gets the 9th state to sign on. But New York, okay, so June 21st is when we have 9 states, but New York doesn't ratify it until July 26th. And how does that happen? Quote, Clinton supporters apparently had the convention under their control, but Hamilton slowly undercut their position, end quote. The final vote is 30 to 27. The vote to which is 3 votes. So the vote to send a delegate is 1 vote. The vote to condemn Hamilton fails by 2 votes. And the vote to ratify the Constitution is 3 votes. That is 6 votes that cast a different way would have completely changed the way the nation formed. Now, it's true. Constitution had already been ratified. It had its 9 signatures. But what's going to happen? How would history be different if New York, then as now, a big deal, the greatest city in the world, a city with 2 Major League Baseball teams that are both really good now, the center of commerce, the erupting center of power as the United States became a global superpower is New York. How different would it have been if New York was like, nope, we're out. You guys have your own constitution. We are going our own way. What would have happened differently without that New York ratifying? Who knows? But it is apparent to me that the reason New York signed on was due at least as much as anyone to Alexander Hamilton. All right. Woo, we did it. We got it there. We ratified our Constitution. George Washington becomes the first president in 1789. And isn't it a little bit nuts that for that period of, 6 to 8 years, the United States had no chief executive at all? But Washington is now there in what the the Constitution site calls lightning speed. In 1789, Hamilton is appointed Secretary of the Treasury. He issues his report to Congress and begins implementing his policies, including a national bank. That's 1789, and by 1795, he will do all that he's ever going to do in government. The Constitution site says, quote, he proposed the establishment of a national bank, the funding of the national debt, the assumption of the war debts of the states, and the encouragement of manufacturing by the federal government. Taken together, these laid the groundwork for the country's rapid rise as a powerful, respected, and industrial nation. Perhaps his most important achievement, however, was his insistence that the Constitution be liberally and broadly interpreted rather than narrowly read, end quote. So all those things that they say that he encouraged, he essentially accomplished. So that was between, in that 6 years, between 1789, when he was appointed, and 1795, when he resigned, he got all that done and he solved the national debt. Oh, the other thing I want to point out was this is maybe politics and it's definitely law, but notice how when he was arguing against non-delegation, in the New York Constitution, he was arguing you should have a narrow interpretation of the New York Constitution. But, and I'm going to reread that quote, perhaps his most important achievement, however, was his insistence that the Constitution be liberally and broadly interpreted rather than narrowly read. So, yeah, what do lawyers do? Well, when it's to your favor for a narrow interpretation, you argue for the narrow interpretation. When you need a broad interpretation, you argue for a broad interpretation. But, and this is a callback to the stuff that we've talked about in prior episodes, what that sentence means, that he wanted the Constitution interpreted broadly, meant he wanted broad federal powers. He wanted a strong central federal government. And That played out in a number of ways, maybe the Whiskey Rebellion, to a lesser extent in the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were anti-immigrant and anti-free speech, but strong federal government. But also, the creation of a national bank, the central treasury, all that was to expand those federal constitutional powers. And as we've talked about before, that precedent for a strong federal government is probably what led the North to be able to believe during the Civil War, like, you can't just secede, right? Where we, the federal government, have the right to preserve this union. We have the right to preserve a strong federal government. Okay, and that was the way the Constitution got interpreted by the middle 1800s, but in the late in the 1790s, when we were trying to figure out what the heck does this Constitution thing even mean, it was Hamilton, more than anyone, who was saying what we need is a strong federal government. And when I say more than anyone, I mean he was the leader of the Federalist Party, and he was the guy who stood up at the convention and gave the speech in favor of a federal government so much stronger than what everybody else thought that should be there. They thought he was nuts. He was a fan of a strong federal government, and according to the Constitution site, and I agree with him, part of his legacy is he helped establish a strong federal government. Without him, that probably wouldn't have happened. Okay. That gets us to the conclusion. So what can we say about this episode, and what can we say about Hamilton overall? For Baumzai, who is a lawyer writing in a law journal, what's interesting is the legal principle that led to the debates that resulted in the Constitution. Quote, the debate over the impost led almost directly to a debate over a new federal charter, the Constitution, which was the legality of delegation, in which the legality of delegation was again at issue, end quote. So Baumzai is interested, hey, there's this legal doctrine of delegation and non-delegation, and it's that debate that led to the creation of the Constitution. But for us, what is the most fun is to notice that Hamilton was absolutely central to those two impost debates. It was he who took up the mantle in New York to get that issue. And then 2 days after New York did that, that became the issue at the Constitutional Convention. Baumzai sees a pretty direct link between that, the debates, these delegation debates and the federal versus state power debates were going on in a lot of places, but no place was more important than New York. And the New York non-delegation issues were almost identical to the ones that got carried forward to the Constitutional Convention. And, as we just learned, Hamilton was dead center of both debates. Okay, and let's just remember that there were two things, right? So we beat, I've said this before, that winning a revolution is no small feat, but that does not fix your problem. The most important thing is not winning the revolution. It's what you do after the revolution, or at least equally important, right? You can't have something to do after the revolution if you don't win the revolution. First, you got to win the revolution, but that's only half the job. China had a revolution, and France had a revolution, and Haiti has had a revolution. There have been many revolutions, but they don't always end. They always promise more liberation, more democracy, peace, and prosperity, but they don't always deliver that. What you do after the revolution is going to pretty much define that. And the two things that we're going to define what happened after the U.S. Revolution were the central power, how much power was the government going to have, and debt. And these two issues are tied together because the ability of the central government to raise funds depended on how much power it had, and that would depend on how much power, how they would be able to address the debt. Now, we have in the past a whole episode addressing this, but essentially Alexander Hamilton almost single-handedly fixes both. First, via the Federalist Papers, he got the Constitution passed. That we already know. The new thing we learned today is the Constitution in the first place probably only happened because Hamilton won, again, by one vote, or won that a delegation should go to that convention. Then he was at that convention, and then he helped draft the final copy of the Constitution, right? So first, they had to pass it. He was key to that. Then he had to get it ratified. And via the Federalist Papers, he was probably more central than anybody else to getting it ratified. And then finally, the last thing he did was then, once that happened, he established enough central federal power to at least create the U.S. Treasury and the first U.S. bank through which he fixed the debt. It is not an exaggeration to say Hamilton got the U.S. Constitution in the first place, then he got it ratified, and then he fixed with that central power that had just been created, he fixed the national debt. And I know I've repeated this many times in many prior episodes, but it's worth not forgetting. An easy way for a government to fail is to fail to manage its debt. Weimar Republic jumps immediately to mind, but there are many, many others. It was a debt crisis that led to the French Revolution. There were, if a government goes too deep in debt, that is a huge problem, and it's a and it is a central reason a whole bunch of governments fail. And the reason our government did not fail due to its debt crisis in the 1790s was Alexander Hamilton. And now, I promised to talk about how crazy this is. There was one vote to create a delegation incident in the first place. There were then 2 votes not to condemn Hamilton. And when that happened, it had those 2 votes go the other way. There was no way they were going to ratify it. And then the vote to ratify was 3 votes. That is 6 votes. By 6 votes of about 180 plus that got cast, 6 votes of those 180. If those flipped, any one of them had flipped the other direction, then we are probably talking about a much different version of history than the one that we have now. Okay, so that's crazy. But also, how crazy is it that the other 2 delegates have to storm out in a huff, like we're leaving the convention, and then Hamilton has to come back under duress, like I don't really want to draft the final version, I guess I have not talked about this probably too much, but he left because he gave a speech and he was bummed. But he came back, and something about, when he was drafting that final document made him believe in the version of the Constitution that did get created enough that he decided that he would become the central voice arguing for its ratification. He didn't just come back and he's like, fine, I didn't get what I wanted. You guys are going to do this. I'll help you draft it, I guess. But then it's on you. You can do whatever you want with it. He came back and said, this is not what I want, but I'm going to help you draft it. And then through my efforts, and almost my efforts alone, me and Madison, we are going to get this sucker ratified. And by God, he did it. So anyway, it is a testament to his ability to flip around or to see when he wasn't going to get everything he wanted and get the best that he could instead. Without Alexander Hamilton, there's no non-delegation debate in New York, at least not one that's close, right? He made the votes close. Without him, there's no non-delegation. Without Hamilton, New York doesn't go to the convention. And without Hamilton and the Federalist Papers, the Constitution doesn't get ratified. Had any of that gone differently, I can't say I know for sure what would happen, but I imagine it would have been very different. I can't imagine the United States succeeding if New York isn't part of the original Constitution, and I can't imagine the Constitution passing, had the Constitution not been ratified, what would have happened instead? It's just a whole different history. And the way it happened was with Hamilton. So I guess the point of this episode is, the first episode that we did was why Alexander Hamilton is even more important than you thought and more essential to it. And it's even more important than is portrayed in the show. And I guess my take on history here, or at least what strikes me, is that he was central to the creation of the Constitution, drafting of the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, and then finally the implementation of that Constitution via the Treasury. You take Hamilton out of that equation, none of those things happen. Whoa, I know, important guy. Which brings us to the end of this series. It's probably worth reflecting. What have we learned? What is important? What have we learned about life and theater? Well, this episode's mostly been about history, so let's kind of focus on that and then kind of talk about the theatrical implications. What do we make about Hamilton? Well, as all human beings, there was some good and some bad. What were the good things he did? He was a key player in the formation of U.S. capitalism and our economic rise. Now, there's good and bad to that, but there is not a United States at all without him fixing the war debt. I think he gets all the credit for that. And as we just learned, there's probably no Constitution without him. Is Alexander Hamilton a massive, successful, or a massive historical figure? And the answer is yes. Now, I'm sure Jefferson and Burr scholars would point out that there were other people around. That takes nothing away from George Washington, right? Without Washington, we probably don't win the war. We probably don't even have an army. So other people made equally significant contributions. It's not like without but Hamilton's, I think, can't be downplayed. It was one of those guys that really made a difference. And that's, I think, just a good thing about Hamilton. And I think you can also say he was a devoted family man. He really did love his wife. He really did love his kids. He was devoted to Angelica as well. He was, his extended family. He was He was devoted to all that. He viewed himself as pursuing honor and duty, right? He thought, I need to do good things to advance the cause of justice in the world. That was central to what he thought he was doing. But there's some bad. Just because you think that's what you're doing doesn't mean that you're succeeding. As many have pointed out, he's not so much of an immigrant as the show suggested, or at least, when immigrants, we get the job done. That's true. That has relevance to our current political climate, and I agree with it. But the historical Hamilton was an outsider, but not exactly an immigrant. And he also took pot shots at other people who were immigrants. And he also was deeply behind the Alien and Sedition Acts, the alien part of the Alien Acts, where basically you could take rights away from aliens whenever you want. This is a weird thing to say, but how Hamilton would fall in the ICE debates, well, he liked strong federal government, and he thought that if people who were not citizens were causing trouble for our country, we should just kick them out. So how does that add up to how he'd stand on the ICE debates? Well, I think you don't know for sure, but it's a little bit harder to think. You should, like John Lawrence totally would be opposed. John Brown totally would be opposed. Alexander Hamilton, not really clear. Anyway, so his record on immigration, his record as an anti-slavery crusader is also much more mixed than the show portrays. I do think that the balance swings in his favor, especially on slavery question, but it's not like he is the pure crusader for the abolition of slavery, at least as much as is portrayed in there. It's not like if he had another 50 years, he totally would have for sure gotten slavery abolished. But I do think, he was part of the Manumission Society. He did do a lot to get slavery abolished, at least in the state of New York. But the show sort of implies that, geez, with only a little more time, this guy would have, it doesn't imply it, it kind of says it. With only, he died pretty young. If he would have had another 50 years like his spouse did, boy, he would have done so much more. And I think that the question is more open on that, at least as far as immigration and slavery goes. And part of that is because after 1795, he just wasn't the same guy. He'd experienced the Reynolds affair broke out. That took a toll on him. He became more bitter and attacked others just because he got frustrated and less to get things done, that it was really kind of a stand-up thing to not have your way at the Constitutional Convention and still be the great advocate for the Constitution. But that's happening in the 1780s. After 1796, he was just mercilessly attacking Burr and Adams in a deep, personal, painful way, and not really, let's get things done, but just like clearly he was just frustrated. He was just mad, and he was just in attack mode. His Federalist Party collapsed. It collapsed largely due to his own unforced errors. Many people say the Reynolds affair was also an unforced error. He resigned from office in 1795, and he never got back in. Others would not appoint him. Washington still gave him some posts, but he did not have the power that he did, and he wasn't going to get elected to anything, especially after the Reynolds affair. The duel was sort of a sad ending to that period of his life. That, we have had 2 episodes here on the duel. There's a lot of details in there. It probably shouldn't have happened. It was a seminal moment in American history, a very poignant event, but it was not the Alexander Hamilton pre-1795 who's doing all those incredible things. It was an older, bitter guy, who for whatever reason couldn't get himself out of a fight that eventually took his life. So it was, all of that is to say that's not quite the take of the show, that the show makes him the hero, portrays him as more, definitely as an immigrant, probably as a free speech crusader, anti-slavery crusader, mover and shaker, got things done. All that is true. And it probably can't. Like, how could you take Chernow's 800-page book or the entire life of Alexander Hamilton and everything he wrote, make it a 2.5-hour show? That's a lot of fun. So I think you get the artistic license to portray history, take the parts of Hamilton's life that are interesting, put those in the show and celebrate them. That I think is all good. But I do think as you examine the life of Alexander Hamilton, historically speaking, you could definitely say that there is more on the dark side than is really explored in there. Because ultimately, there were some contradictions in the life of Alexander Hamilton. He was an immigrant who himself favored the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were decidedly anti-immigrant. He was a devoted family man who had at least one really stupid and really public affair. And, devoted family man, but what he did to his spouse by publishing the Reynolds pamphlet, where he publicly confessed the affair, after she had publicly defended him and not telling her that he was going to publish it. I am genuinely convinced, looking at the letters and looking at the correspondence and reading the history behind this, he genuinely loved his family and his wife. And the Reynolds affair was a massive mistake, but it was nonetheless a mistake that he made. And then going public with it in a way that really left his wife in a bad spot. He was a politician who found himself out of office. He founded the very first, it's the firsts are hard, but one of the very first political parties, the Federalist Party, but then he saw it collapse. He was a great soldier who sold out former ally France in favor of England within a decade of the war ending. It was the right move economically, probably not the right move if your former military allies no longer become of use to you. Do you just cast them aside? Well, he was a little quick to do that. So Hamilton definitely had these contradictions in his character. Most of us do. Most of us make mistakes. He made big successes, so he had big failures. And I think that is Alexander Hamilton. But by all accounts, he had a great life of huge historical significance. And the show is a tale well told that had to make some choices about what it was going to emphasize and what it was going to leave out. But ultimately, that show lands squarely on the side of inclusion of equity and equality. It tries to retell history in a way that reminds us that the battles for equality and justice and fairness are eternal. They come up at any generation. They are ongoing. Those fights are still here, and they have not yet been won. And I think that's quite an accomplishment for the show. And I think it is definitely standing for including more people, especially at a time when this country is turning towards excluding more. Okay. Remember that we have more trivia out there for you so that hopefully in some of these off weeks, if you are not listening to the show, you're able to tune in and get a trivia fix. If trivia question answer format is fun for you, we're going to have some coming up. Our next show is going to be about Chicago. We are trading in revolutionary history for Chicago Vice. They both have some sex and some scandals and some violence and some treachery and some politics somewhere in there. We are going to find more lessons for life and theater, and we're going to do all that on the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.